So if you Google atheism or non-religion on the internet, you will find easily a number of views in graphs, such as the one presented here, which explain, for instance, that atheism is on the rise around the globe. Charles Taylor has described a non-believing world, and in his book, A Secular Age, he underlines three aspects of secularity. One of them is the new conditions of belief, which are that non-belief or against belief has become feasible alternative. Habermas also states that in the contemporary age, people have a wide variety of choices regarding religious belief. As a result, a widespread discourse is that non-belief or unbelief seems now to be the default option in our societies, and media reports often portray the collapse of organized religion and the steady decline of religious belief, chiefly in Western Europe, but also increasingly around the world. For a more precise picture, though, it's important to underline that there are variations across the world. Non-religion is not distributed evenly. For instance, the Fides Agency claimed in 2017 that the number of Catholics is on the increase everywhere in the world except in Europe. In Western Europe, with variations depending on the country, the number of people declaring a religious affiliation is decreasing. There's also an increase in the number of people claiming to be atheists, but again, as you can see, with important discrepancies across Europe. A Pew Research Center survey in 2012 said that religiously unaffiliated, including agnostics and atheists, make up about 18% of Europeans. But diversity again, here they have been highlighted in different colors for it to be more obvious. In Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, Christian shares of the population have mostly been stable or even increasing, and it has even been known as to have a resurgence since the fall of the Soviet regime. And in some countries where communist regimes once repressed religious worship, it is now an increase. Meanwhile, fewer Western Europeans say they are currently Christian than say they were raised Christian. In Belgium, for example, 55% of respondents currently identify as Christian, compared with 83% saying that they were raised Christian. There are also differences in the percentage of people declaring that they are a religious person. Numbers vary from over 90% for Poland to less than 30% for Belarus. I've highlighted Italy as a courtesy to our host here. The figures on this chart display the percentage of people in various European countries who said, I don't believe there's any kind of spirit, God, or life force. Here again, with the European Union as a whole at 20%, it goes from a high percentage in France, for instance, 40%, or in the Czech Republic with 37%, and very low in Greece, 4%, Cyprus, 3%, Malta, 2%, Romania, 1%. Pew Research Center has combined various criteria and defined what they call religiosity. And they range it from highly religious, and that combines saying religion is very important in one's life, attending religious services at least once a month, praying at least once a day, and believing in God with absolute certainty. That's the one side of the scale, and the other side is low religious observance with the opposite information. And using this combined measure shows that overall, Central and Eastern Europeans are more likely than Western Europeans to be highly religious. So I guess that by now you've had your fill of maps and charts, and I'll try to slow down on that. I'm coming to a different approach. You probably have noticed that while I was commenting on all these figures and maps, I spoke of belief, spoke of affiliation, spoke of religious practices, and you probably have come to the question, well, what exactly are we speaking of when saying non-religion? And that's the good question. Trying to understand religion, which I will not try to define now, that's too much of a tricky business, but to keep it simple, it's firstly a concern about belief. And sociologists of religion acknowledge that some people believe in God and some don't, and this, as you know, traces way back in the history of humankind. But then in the recent years, the number of such people started growing, and they also became more visible, and realization dawned that this comprises many different kinds of people. And firstly, there is no such thing as two blocks, believers on the one side and non-believers on the other side. And people can believe very strongly or have some vague convictions or have no convictions at all, but they will not be either on the one side or on the other side, but rather located between these two attitudes, some closer to one and some closer to the other. And distributing things like that allows to distinguish better, for instance, atheists who claim that there are no gods, skeptics who doubt the existence of God, and agnostics who say that the question cannot be answered, for instance. Atheists themselves, in what sociologists will call self-referencing or self-designation, take note of this variety of postures, and I have here two examples. The International Atheist Alliance proposes that atheists be registered in a process that's not unlike the demand for recognition of many religious groups. They suggest people declare themselves on their site, and they offer different categories that I have listed here with two different examples. But religion is a multi-dimensional reality. It's not only about belief, but as many may say, by calling it the three Bs, it's also about belonging and behaving. The variations on belief come together on a second axis, which relate more to the belong and behave part of the definition of religion. And there's also a gradation in the relationship to these religious institutions and religious practices, which most often is the churches. That is, do people accept and support these institutions, or do they fight and refuse them? Also, as sociology of religion, which is a rather recent discipline, progressed, and as researchers took in broader approaches and started, for instance, to take interest in religion from Asia, such as Buddhism, but also to take a closer look at the way people relate to claims and dogmas of their own religious groups, it became clear that there are differences among people as to the strength of beliefs, but also as to its contents. And believing in God has to be taken under two aspects, the one of belief and the one of God. So all this allows many combinations, and the results of sociological surveys display various realities. So you'd have the classical portrait of, let's say, a Catholic, a good Catholic, who'd have strong faith, claim that God exists, and support the church. But some Catholics nowadays have lost trust in the institution. That would give us another picture. And there could be also people who are close to the institution, but claim they have a strong belief, but that it is not in God. And that has been the case, maybe you've heard that, of Klaas Hendriksen. He's a minister of the Protestant Church in the Netherlands, and he declared that he believes in a God who does not exist. And he's not the only one, because in 2007, 42% of the members of the Protestant Church of Netherlands have described themselves as non-theists. And it does not only belong to Protestantism, because 35% of Catholics in France claim to not believe in God. There are also convicted atheists who have a strong belief that there is no God, but think that religious institutions can have their interest. So as you see, the combinations are multiple, and this can be the picture of non-religion from the starting point of what surveys concerning religion can reveal. These surveys started more or less like this when sociologists set to try to examine more clearly what people said when it came to religion. The first surveys more or less asked people about their religion and asked them to choose an answer. And those who didn't want any of the offered answers said they were none of the above. And in 2001, Barry Kosmin was commenting the American Religious Identification Survey, and he made it into the term nons. He wanted to have another word, that unaffiliated, in order not to convey the idea that affiliated was the thing to be, was the norm. The creation of a new term indicates that there's an interesting reality to study. And interest on these nons and on non-religion as a whole is growing quickly and steadily since the beginning of the millennium, namely among sociologists of religion. And this interest on, lost something there. there we are. We now include sociology of non-religion in sociology of religion, as illustrated, by instance, by the decision that was taken in the Ural network to add a section concerning non-religion in the Ural website of information. So non-religion is taken here as the best possible term among many that exist, that is non-belief, non-religiousness, and many others, and none of them are totally satisfying. Neither is non-religion, for all the reasons that I've just highlighted, that it's such a diverse reality, we don't really know from which end we should take it. But for lack of a better word, and at present, this is the most commonly used term, so that's the one I'm sticking to. This interest on non-religion also leads to try and have a closer look at this set of postures and attitudes, and to examine the variations in the relationship to religion or to non-religion. I have highlighted the diversity at the scale of individual, and it makes up, as you've seen, different images of what non-religion is. But now we can have a look at what it is considered when people are taken as a group. There are common features of the non-believers, and in the Oxford Handbook, Navarro, Rivera, and Caesar describe the demography of the non-believing population around the world, and they base on the ISSP survey in 2008. According to them, the typical global non-believer is young, male, educated, and most likely lives in Northern Europe, Japan, or in communist or former communist nations. Another interesting fact, and I'll come back to it later, is that very often these non-believing people come from a religious background. That's for a general type. But when considering what constitutes their non-religion, one needs to be more specific. And this is obvious, for instance, from a survey from Public Religion Research Institute on this nons, which divides them into 3 subgroups. The rejectors, who consider that religion is not important in their life and does more harm than good. The unaffiliated believers, who say that religion is important to them, but they don't declare that they belong to a religion. The numbers here are for Americans. And the apatheists. Apatheist is a combination of apathy and theism in an attitude that's the very question of whether or not deities exist, or is to say that it's not relevant or meaningful in life. Apatheists are not even interested in addressing any claims for or against God. It's almost like, I don't care about it. The part of these apatheists, or what we call often religiously indifferent, seems to grow. And the Wynne-Gallup surveys for Europe show that the number of convinced atheists is falling, and the number of undecided raises. That's underlined by Pierre Bréchon in the chapters he wrote in the 2 books whose cover is there. More precise research than the one of PPRI was led by Silver and Coleman, and they distinguished 6 categories of non-religious people: activist or militant, agnostics and atheist intellectuals, for whom atheism is primarily based on philosophical or scientific knowledge; research agnostics, who asked the question of God's existence without making a decision; the anti-theists, who are sure of their atheistic convictions and are rather quick to target religions out of an assumed anti-clericalism; the non-theists, who are indifferent to the religious question; and finally the atheists or ritual agnostics, who, while having no religion, are interested in religious phenomena and even can take part in religious rituals for reasons of tradition or aestheticism. This last pack is worth dwelling a little upon, and among others, Johannes Quack has highlighted that some non-religious people mark the distance from any normative offer, but some want to differentiate it from religion, but still maintain certain practices, especially collective practices, which are borrowed from religion. In the United States, researchers Semino and Smith describe American secular humanists who use Tibetan prayer bowls to introduce a moment of meditation during their meetings. Another example is among the organized forms of non-religion, The phenomenon of Sunday assembly, which emerged in England in 2013, can be noted. It exists now all over Europe, and it offers non-religious Sunday meetings which retain the outward features of certain religious assemblies, as you can see in the photos there. Another topic is something that I've already mentioned earlier. Many of those belonging to the group of non-religion are people who have been raised religious or who used to have religious convictions and affiliations. They have quit their religious group, and which has led to some word puns like calling them or calling themselves not the nuns but the dons, to express they are done with the church, they've had enough of the church, or the guns, they are now gone from the church. So of course the question would be, why are they leaving? Armand Mauss has studied this movement away from religion, which he calls apostasy in a purely technical and descriptive sense, as a step away from beliefs, and he distinguishes three ways of distancing from religion. That is an intellectual movement, a social movement with a dissolution of ties, and an emotional movement. The American sociologist Zuckerman elaborated from that, and he defines 8 main reasons that lead people to abandon their religion: disagreement with the parents, education, a tragic personal event such as personal loss or misfortune, encountering other religions, the influence of friends and relationships, politics, sexual morality, the question of Satan and hell and religious dogma in general, or a negative view of religious people. You can find some of these categories expressed there, but this survey was more focused on events than on influence of other people. So education, friends and relationship, encountering other religions lack here. But you can see that all these different possibilities come into play. This allows me to come to the question of what is called the retention rate, that is, the capacity for a group to keep its members. The retention rate of religiosity depends on the dominant religions of the country, although other factors intervene also, such as the strength of family ties, which is certainly an important factor. In societies which are more individualized, the people tend to feel that they can or even must distinguish themselves from their elders, and so this plays in retention rate. Surveys in Europe show a significant amount of intergenerational religious distancing, that is, difference between parents and children, or difference between adults and their own parents as concerns religion. Transmission is an important aspect of religious change. The results from the ISSP survey show that religious socialization in childhood, that is, having received religious education or having had religious practice or having religious belonging, has a strong influence on religiosity of today's adults. From one generation to the next, there is a loss of religiosity, but very little movement in the opposite direction. To say it more simply, if someone has received a religious education, they can move away from religion in adulthood. However, if one has never had religious education, then conversion to religion is very rare. Retention rate, that I've just explained, is the matter of how individuals relate to religion, and the changes that can happen under this aspect is one element of the dynamics of non-religion. It's an element at the level of the individuals, examined at the level of the groups. But comments can also be made at the level of society. The decade 2000 has seen the emergence of what has been called the new atheism. It's not an organized movement, rather a current. And this has developed mainly in the United Kingdom based on the writings of the British scientist Richard Dawkins. He had a Christian upbringing, and he turned away from his faith when he was a teenager and advocates atheism, developing a sharp critique of religion. He founded the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, and the mission is, I quote, to remove the influence of religion from science, education, and public policy, and to eliminate the stigma surrounding atheism and non-belief. He published this book, The God Delusion, in 2006, and he has supported the anti-belief bus advertising campaign with posters proclaiming, "God probably doesn't exist, now stop worrying and enjoy life." This has spread from the UK to many other countries, Canada, Italy, Spain, Brazil, and so on. And this assertive atheism is very obvious in the United States, where groups of people calling themselves bright emerge. The term bright plays on the double meaning of enlightened and brilliant. The bright advocate a worldview that is opposed to any supernatural. So they say no God, no ghosts, no fairies, no Easter bunny, no whatever. They claim pride in being atheist, and they want to enlighten believers. This new atheism that I've just described is not only the movement of a population that wants to live without religious beliefs or affiliation, it's also the perception of religion as a source of conflict, tension, and intolerance. They have statements such as, if there were no religion, there would not be all these wars. But you see the assertive dimension, and that's another illustration, is the story. In the years 2000, a false information circulated in Australia saying that if over 8,000 people declared their faith to be a Jedi, then the state would have to legally recognize this as a religion. So in the population census of 2001, more than 70,000 people answered the question about their religion, claiming to be a Jedi Knight. And this continued in a 5-yearly census following, one in 2006-2011, putting in 2011 the number of Jedi in Australia just behind the number of Sikh and above the number of Seventh-day Adventists. And it spread to New Zealand, Canada, England, and Wales, and even the Czech Republic, who has large Jedi contingents. And this led the Atheist Foundation of Australia to run a poster campaign that you can see there to encourage Australians to tick the non-religion box if they consider that they have no religion. They regard these self-declared Jedi as, in fact, non-religious people who answered Jedi, and then, instead of saying they are not religious, they are making Australia seem more religious than it is. And there is a will to assert non-religion, which sociologist Grace Davey illustrates by saying it's an increasingly articulate secular lobby. And she points out that the new atheism is fundamentally reactive, which explains why it occurs together with a certain return of religion to the public sphere. Each encourages the other, as responses to the bus campaign show. In the United States, researchers Scheitler, Corcoran, and Halligan reached a similar conclusion based on a study of social surveys. They show that the demographic growth of nones has influenced religion in terms of a greater congruence between belief, religious identity, and religious behavior. Similarly, Dawkins' movement is a reaction to what he sees as offensive obscurantism, and a typical mimetic effect. Atheist or free-thinking groups feel they have to react to the dynamics of activist religious groups, while the latter feel threatened or attacked by the rise of secularism. So in contemporary Europe, religion and non-religion are in a reciprocal relationship of influence, mutually conditioning each other. Thank you.